Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide. And this time we're visiting a Yorkshire city you're perhaps less likely to have visited. Unless of course you're a fan of rugby league, like we are, or maybe modernist sculpture, or perhaps you enjoy an on-location Shakespearean history. For episode 7 of Ye Olde Guide, we've been to Wakefield in West Yorkshire. My name is Liam McGrath, and together with my co-host historian, Daniel Gooch, we're bringing you a guide to the history of the towns and cities of England. So welcome back to the show, Daniel. What were the highlights for you of our trip to Wakey?
Well, we have to mention the rugby league first, don't we?
We do.
That was excellent. It was a nice
Thoroughly
treat for us.
enjoyable. It was a very interesting ground if you like old-fashioned stands and beer, and we had access to the posh section, didn't we?
Well, there was a bar, yeah. But posh enough.
And
had San Miguel, I think.
And we also went to a few pubs and found ourselves ended up in Reflex. Before we did any of that stuff, we had a good walk around the town. So if you're new to Ye Olde Guide, this is how the show works. We explore a town or a city in England and we look at its historical significance in 4 broad categories: culture, politics and war, science and industry, and urban heritage. And we talk about the places and the sites that you can discover in the town if you visit yourself. And then we give a score for historical significance in our opinion. And at the end, we have a bonus category called reality versus expectations. More information can be found on our website, yeoldeguide.com, along with information about other episodes. You can also go to the website to feed back on this episode and contest the scores that we give, if you so wish. But before we get into those categories, Daniel, could we have a quick overview of Wakefield?
Well, the first known settlers in Wakefield were the Angles, who sailed up the River Calder, which runs up to Wakefield from the North Sea, and they built a settlement which was really just 3 lanes converging around a church. Later, Wakefield became part of the Danelaw following the Viking invasion. The Danelaw was a part of England which essentially was ruled over by the invading Danes, while most of the rest of the country was Anglo-Saxon controlled. It's been suggested that, in fact, the idea of Yorkshire exceptionalism and kind of the exceptional nature of Yorkshire humour, character, stems from this period. And it's also possible that Wakefield got its name during this period from a Viking chief called Waka. That's been speculated, but no one actually knows for sure.
Good name, Waka.
After the Norman conquest, or rather I should say during, because it took several years in reality, Wakefield, along with many other towns in the north, resisted Norman invasion, was actually one of the richest towns in the country at this point, but the successful Norman invaders basically razed the city to the ground during the harrying of the north, which was a period of kind of lengthy, heavy reprisals wrought against the northern cities which resisted the Norman invasion. Later on, Wakefield prospered from the late 14th century. It specialised in our old friend, which we talk about every week, it seems, the cloth trade.
So they must have a lot of clothes back in the medieval period.
You always need clothes, don't you? I suppose it's a solid trade to go into. Later in Tudor times, Wakefield became the largest city in West Yorkshire. It was double the size and population of Leeds or Bradford, which seems crazy to think about now. It did prosper into the 18th century as its industry became settled around cattle trading, then later manufacturing around the river area and coal mining. And it became a city in 1888, although it did still, and still has to this day, remained fairly small compared with lots of the big cities which surround it.
Well, that's right. It's surrounded by one of the most densely populated parts of the United Kingdom. You've got Leeds to the north, Sheffield to the south, Huddersfield, Manchester's not far away, really. So thank you for that overview, Daniel. And, well, let's go on to our first category, culture. In our first category, culture, we explore influences of the town or city we visit in the worlds of art, film, literature, or entertainment. So, what's this Merry Wakefield nickname all about?
I've read in a few places that Wakefield was supposedly quite a happy place in the past, which I suppose is a nice thing, and hence it had a nickname, Merry Wakefield. I've tried to research this, but I can't actually find any more specific information on this nickname other than a few vague allusions to revelry in the city and a couple of book titles which reference Merry Wakefield. There didn't seem to be much more to it than that, but I suppose these things have to come from somewhere. So we'll start with the assumption that Wakefield is probably a happy, jolly place.
Well, that's nice. It was certainly jolly when we were there. A very friendly and jolly place. Do you think it was because it was prosperous? Does prosperity bring happiness?
That's a very, very philosophical question.
Let's move on to the world of art, the world of sculpture, because an artist born in Wakefield who's left quite a significant heritage in the city.
Absolutely. We're talking about Barbara Hepworth here. She's a very important modernist sculptor who was born and educated in Wakefield. She had a really prestigious career that spanned 5 decades. She even had a Google Doodle in August 2020. So even today, people are still celebrating her. Examples of her work are Single Form, which was commissioned for the UN headquarters in New York. So that's a very famous example of her work. And she has said herself how important her formative years in Yorkshire were. Direct quote from her is, "The whole of this Yorkshire background means more to me as the years have passed. I draw on these early experiences not only visually in texture and contour, but humanly. The importance of man in landscape was stressed by the seeming contradiction of the industrial towns springing out of the inner beauty of the country." And probably the greatest celebrations of her legacy near Wakefield today are the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which is not too far away and displays some of her works. But most importantly for our purposes, the Hepworth Gallery in Wakefield, which opened in 2011, obviously is named after her, and awards the annual Hepworth Prize. Liam, I think you got a chance to visit the Hepworth, didn't you?
Yeah, I was very impressed. There's 2 things about Barbara Hepworth's legacy I find interesting. First, as you've mentioned, that she was educated in the city. She was inspired by her head mistress to do sculpture in the city, and she met fellow sculptor Henry Moore when studying in nearby Leeds. He was from Castleford and is the other modernist British sculpture that's very well known. But the second legacy that she gives is the art gallery, which is quite an extraordinary trapezoidal, almost brutalist structure, and it kind of reflects the materials and the scale of the monumental sculptural works inside, and it's got a rather nice sculpture garden outside. And one feature of the building itself was it has floor-to-ceiling windows which give strategic views of the skyline of Wakefield and the River Calder, and we'll talk a bit about that setting a bit later. And it's got that sort of modern large white cube style experience, similar to what you get at Tate Modern Extension, a fitting place to display these monumental sculptural works.
I suppose the next thing we should probably talk about is maybe the musical legacy of Wakefield.
We've got the Crib, and we've got Noel Gay as well.
The Cribs actually have a star Wakefield Walk of Fame, and they had a 5-month exhibition at Wakefield Museum in 2017. So there's a little bit of celebration of their fame there in Wakefield at the moment. But yeah, we should also talk about Noel Gay. Noel Gay is from Wakefield. He is a musician who wrote the musical Me and My Girl in the 1930s. Have you ever seen that musical, Liam? Have you heard of it?
I've not. I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
Do you know any of the songs from it? Let me give you some of them. Lambeth Walk,
yeah.
You know that one?
Oh, of course, Lambeth Walk. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
The Sun Has Got His Hat On, Leaning on a Lamppost. I think George Formby famously played that one. They also wrote Run Rabbit Run, which I think was one of my granddad's favourite songs.
These songs were around the 30s and 40s.
1930s, that's right. He gained his first musical education in Wakefield, so it's clearly quite important in forming his musical interests. He actually filled in for the cathedral's choirmaster when he was 8 years old, and was deputy organist at 12. So these are pretty famous songs, you've got to say. I think most people would know them. And there's clearly a legacy from the teaching, the learning that Noel Gay had in Wakefield and the cathedral choir and as a cathedral organist that's fed through to that.
And we've also got a Victorian novelist born and lived in Wakefield.
George Gissing. I don't know if that's a name many people would have heard of. He was described in a Spectator article a few years ago as the last great Victorian novelist. What he's really famous for is writing with tremendous realism about the lower middle classes. His life actually infused his work. He was in prison for theft. He was down in his luck for most of his life. And the tedium of his life, of teaching and to some extent poverty, is really reflected in his novels. He was educated in Wakefield, and although he left when he was young, the Wakefield Historical Society still asserts that his experiences are reflected in his novels. There is a Gissing Trust in Wakefield now, and there's a blue plaque at his former home as well.
So before we go on to the scores, I mentioned in the preamble that one might visit Wakefield to enjoy an al fresco Shakespearean play.
Yes. This is Henry VI Part 3, I think you're thinking of.
Yes.
This is the Battle of Wakefield, which we are absolutely going to come on to talk about in more detail.
We're going to come back to that
later. But this has a key scene set at Sandal Castle, just on the outskirts of Wakefield, which is where the Battle of Wakefield took place. It's a key scene where Richard of York is killed, and the play has been performed in the castle ruins. So yes, when they're putting that on, you can absolutely see it there.
And that's the play, the Shakespearean play, with the most battle scenes, I gather, and the longest soliloquy.
The number of battle scenes doesn't surprise me at all. Before I go on to scoring, I'm going to very quickly mention a few more things. There is a possible link with the nursery rhyme, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. It's been suggested that prisoners at Wakefield Prison exercise around the mulberry tree in the exercise yard. I don't think there's any real supporting evidence for this, but it's a fairly prevalent local myth, I think.
It's there in Wakefield Museum.
It is, that's true. Yep, they did mention
Played on repeat.
Yeah. It's also been claimed by some local historical experts that the first amusement park in the UK was at Lofthouse Gate, which is just to the north of Wakefield, in 1908. This had a pavilion, a haunted house, a skating rink and an aerodrome. But I can't actually see much to back this claim up, and all other sources show that amusement parks were part of British life since about the 1840s. So I'm afraid, without further clarification on what that means, do email in if you have it. I can't really accept the claim. The site does nonetheless have a very interesting history. It was used later as a World War I prisoner of war camp, and then it was an industrial site with a brickworks. And the final thing I really do have to mention here, possibly the most important thing, 2 members of Black Lace are from Wakefield. If you remember Black Lace from our childhood.
Yeah.
They actually filmed the video for Superman at Casanova's nightclub. And Jane McDonald, who you've probably heard of, is also from Wakefield, another musical connection there, is actually dancing in the video. And to be honest, the nightclub looks quite nice, but I think it's closed down now, unfortunately. So we couldn't go there. We had to make do with Reflex.
Brilliant. Right, on to your scores.
Culture, I think we've found, is quite a difficult category for smaller places to score well in, especially places which don't have, say, a university. But I think we do have quite a bit here that's reasonably impressive. You've got a music scene going on throughout really the 20th century, but also in modern times you have the Long Division Festival, which goes on in Wakefield to this day. You have a record label that's from Wakefield as well, and this is all spoken about in the Wakefield Museum. They cover this in pretty good detail. I feel like some of this, like the UK's first theme park, the link with Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, is a bit tenuous. I feel like I'm suggesting things and then arguing straight against them. But the musical legacy clearly comes through from training and teaching that people have had from a young age in Wakefield to world famous songs of this day. I know we often like to say that we like to give more points for things that happened here rather than things that were done by people from here. But I also think we can give points for things that are celebrated. And I think you have to give positive points for the fact that Wakefield has celebrated so well its connection with Barbara Hepworth, as long as the more intangible legacy of the music festival, which still goes on today. So I think I'm going to give it a slightly positive score. It's going to be a 5.5 from me.
I was surprised and impressed because I didn't know much about Wakefield going into our visit. And I think there's a couple of things that I want to bring out. One, you've mentioned continuation of the music scene. But really, the main thing for me is the Hepworth Gallery, which I think is one of the best galleries if you're interested in abstract art. It's a large display, its setting's excellent, and the collection, if you're someone that likes 20th century abstract art. I think it should be on your list of places to visit, and not just the collection, but also the building and the setting itself. The exhibition very effectively told the story of Hep, who had taken great care to document the production of her artwork, so you could enjoy seeing how the work evolved and how she moved through mediums, from wood, stone to a bronze phase, and that was all set out quite nicely. So I think it's more than I expect, but being one of the smaller places that we visit on the podcast, as you say, it doesn't really give rise to a scene or a movement. I'm going to give it a respectable score. I'm going to give it a 5. Into our second category, where we look at the influence Wakefield has had in national politics and war. And this is brilliant. We've got one of the most important battle sites in English history right here in Wakefield.
Indeed we do. We're going to come back to talk in more detail now about the Battle of Wakefield. This happened in 1460, was really one of the most important battles in the Wars of the Roses, which I'm assuming most listeners will have heard of, the dynastic struggles for control of the British crown in the 15th century. It's particularly significant because the Yorkist leader, Richard, Duke of York, who might well have become king later on, was killed during the battle. It was fought in the depths of winter. The Duke of York was camped up at Sandal Castle, just on the outskirts of Wakefield, over Christmas. One of his foraging groups was attacked on the 30th of December, and he decided to retaliate. He rode out to the castle and was attacked from all sides, which stopped him from retreating back to the castle. He was outnumbered, some estimates say, by about 5-1, lost in about an hour, was captured and beheaded. His head was later exhibited over Micklegate in York, which is where I believe the Henry VII Museum is today, along with 3 other leading Yorkist nobles. And there's a memorial to him on the battle site now. As we mentioned before, it's depicted in Henry VI Part 3. It happened in Sandal Magna, which is, as we said, is just the south of central Wakefield by Sandal Castle. You can get there today by bus, by train even, or if you're really keen, you can walk or cycle. And there's an interesting cultural legacy which has come from this, which is the two kind of phrases, I think you'd call them. One is Dickie's Meadow, which is a Yorkshire phrase warning you against doing something risky just in case you end up in Dickie's Meadow, i.e. Sandal's Meadow. The phrase isn't recorded until much later, but it's suggested this is referencing Dickie, Richard of York, doing something hasty and risky and ending up dying in Sandal Meadow, in his meadow. The other one is the mnemonic, Richard of York gave battle in vain, which is, of course, the colours of the rainbow, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That refers to this battle here. Richard of York tried so hard, but ultimately he just died before he got what he needed.
So let's get this straight. York was in Sandal Castle, which is a ruined castle now, but it looks like it has quite a tall sort of Motte and Bailey type structure. He would have been sitting pretty in there, wouldn't he? And yet he was drawn out.
Yeah.
Was that a strategic error by York?
It's been suggested it was a tremendous strategic error.
A blunder.
Perhaps hasty, perhaps reckless, perhaps he was just fed up of sitting in there in the cold. But yeah, certainly it seems the fact he went out so hastily led to him being attacked and outnumbered, and that's why he lost so quickly.
So if you're a fan of castles, you've got Wakefield Castle, and actually not far away, nearby Pontefract's got a castle as well, which was implicated in that very period. So that's one of the most important battles in English history, I think it's fair to say.
I think so. And it's, of course, the main cultural legacy, as well as those phrases, is, of course, its depiction in Shakespeare. The BBC did a tremendous adaptation of that play in its series, The Hollow Crown, a few years ago. It was absolutely brilliant depiction of the battle.
Beyond that, we always like to talk about the Civil War in Ye Olde Guide. Did Wakefield, what side was Wakefield on?
Initially, I think it was a royalist town. There was a battle here in May 1643, just around Warren Gate and Northgate, when the parliamentarians captured it. So, as with many places, it was held by different people, different sides at different times. What you can actually see now on Cannonball Hill, which is next to the site of the old castle, I think Wakefield Castle rather than Sandal Castle, is Cannonball Hill, which is named after all the cannonballs which were excavated there, dating from the Civil War.
You mentioned in the introduction something that made my ears prick, the harrying of the North.
The harrying of the North was essentially William the Conqueror's reprisals against northern towns and cities which had resisted the Norman invasion from 1066 onwards. Because, of course, the Norman conquest of England didn't just happen overnight. There was a whole country to conquer and subdue, not just the bit of it that had travelled down to Hastings to fight him. Really, after the Norman conquest, Wakefield was simply razed to the ground during the harrying of the North because of the local resistance to the Norman invasion. It had previously been one of the richest towns in northern England, but was destroyed completely, and supposedly no land could be ploughed there for 9 years, such was the destruction. And the Domesday Book, that great Norman record of the value of land just after the conquest, describes most of the town as simply waste.
I'm just going to wind forward a bit now because I don't feel there's much to say in terms of Wakefield's political influence in the country, but it is the centre, or it was the administrative centre for West Yorkshire for a long time.
Yes, it was the county town of West Yorkshire, despite its relatively small size. From 1889 to 1986, and the various guises of what West Yorkshire actually meant, which is when the council was abolished and all its 5 districts became unitary authorities. That meant simply that it had a lot of important public buildings, including council offices, courts, and police officers. Its status as the local centre of administrative power may in fact date back to the Viking conquest. We touched on this earlier, but to give more detail on it, the 3 ridings of Yorkshire, the 3 administrative parts it's divided into even today, were introduced under Danish rule. And it's been suggested that Wakefield may actually have been the capital of the West Riding under the Danes as well. So there's a real link there, been speculated, from Viking invasion all the way up to almost the present day.
Now, we not necessarily somewhere you'd want to visit on a fun trip to Wakefield, but I don't think we could go past without mentioning it. Wakefield Prison.
As you say, it's not the sort of thing we would usually cover in this podcast, but it is right in the centre of the city, and it's such a prominent part of the city's urban fabric that we can't really not mention it. It's been nicknamed Monster Mansion, as it contains so many of the UK's most high-profile and dangerous convicts. But it actually has quite a lengthy history. It dates back to the 16th century, when it was originally built as the West Riding House of Correction. Houses of correction were authorised by an Act of Parliament in the 1570s, which basically required that the provision locally of institutions where the unemployed poor could work and, as the Act put it, be corrected in their habits by laborious discipline, which sounds incredibly harsh and dated to me. But in respect to the prison buildings today, most of those date from the 19th century. Today, it's a Category A prison, which is the reason why it holds so many dangerous prisoners.
Are you ready to go on to the scores?
I think I am. Your turn to go first, I think.
I think I'm ready to go on to the scores. And I think that the military battle in which the Duke of York lost his head is so important in English history. The War of the Roses, sort of thing you learn about at school. And it happened right here in Wakefield. But more than that, we've got Sandal Castle and its and the battle's depiction in a Shakespearean play. So I think this is quite an important site in the world of war, English history of war, in any case. And there's something you can see to experience it, so I'm going to give it a 6.
6, that's a decent score. I'm just going to put that into the spreadsheet.
Thank you.
Very, very important we keep the spreadsheet up to date. My thoughts here are it's clearly been a pretty important political settlement on at the very least a local level for centuries. The harrying of the North, we mentioned, was probably a reflection of this. If there was such a concerted effort to destroy a town or a city, it's got to be worth doing. And it's continued to be that on a local level later on as the capital of West Yorkshire. On the military side of things, there has been plenty of military action here, including a battle which had a really crucial impact on the political development of English history. One criticism I might make of it is I would have liked to see this mentioned a bit more in the museum. Wakefield Museum is quite small. We have to give them some allowances for that. But to me, this is one of the most interesting parts and significant parts of its history. And it just isn't really mentioned. That may be because it's covered in a bit more detail at Sandal Castle, which we can come on to a bit more later. But I always like to give extra credit to a city which really properly celebrates the important and interesting things that have happened there. So that's probably going to hold it back from the top marks. But I'm also going to give it a positive score because at the very least, in the local and regional level, there's been some political importance, if not national or international so much. But on the military side, hugely important. So I'm going to give it a 6 as well.
In the third category, science and industry, we look at how our town has contributed to the success of a major industry or scientific achievement, or some kind of technological progress or influence in the world of trade. When you visit Wakefield, you are struck by a legacy of grand municipal buildings and large merchant houses, which indicate a degree of historic wealth. In which industries was Wakefield distinguished?
We'll go through it chronologically, I think.
Yeah.
The first one is the cloth trade, which
the cloth trade.
We do have to cover. It was important to Wakefield. Really, the cloth trade was the reason that Wakefield started to prosper as a city from the late 14th century. As areas like West Yorkshire, which specialised in the production and export of finished cloth, became wealthier. Now, this is quite important, the fact it specialised in finished cloth, because these areas grew, whereas others which are specialised simply in the export of wool actually saw urban decline at this time. So clearly the demand and the wealth created by the cloth trade was much higher for that extra step in the manufacturing process. And it helped it become the largest city in West Yorkshire, as we mentioned earlier, in Tudor times, twice the size of Leeds or Bradford. William Camden, who was writing during the reign of Elizabeth I, described Wakefield as a town famous for clothing, for greatness, for fair building, a well-frequented mercate. So clearly this trade was having a positive effect on the urban landscape and the wealth of the town.
What did they do with all this cloth in the Tudor times? I mean, everywhere was the centre of the cloth trade.
I think they exported it to a great extent. Exported it, wore it, the usual things.
Wow, they must have all looked very stylish with all that cloth. So let's go on to the Victorian economy.
Well, in the Victorian times, one thing we should mention is the cattle market. The cattle market actually opened a bit earlier in 1765 and was held every fortnight on the site of the present-day Royal Mail Sorting Office. It was one of the largest cattle markets in the country, and it's been mentioned several times in different contemporary travel writings. So clearly this was pretty important to the town's economy and a great and probably pretty smelly site there. But the Victorian industry matured later on, included corn. Wakefield seems to have had a large corn exchange. Shipyards centred around Thorns Wharf in the city. Rope factories and malt houses. Again, many of these were based around the River Calder. And Wakefield's mature Victorian economy was summed up pretty well in an 1887 gazetteer, which said of Wakefield, it has considerable provisions of woollens, worsteds, and hosiery, breweries, roperies, foundries, railway wagon works, and cocoa fibre mat manufactories. It is a great mart for corn, malt and wool, and in the neighbourhood are extensive coal mines. There are many other descriptions of just how extensive the industry was around the river. Clearly, there was an awful lot going on there. And what's also clear that whoever was running the show must have been getting pretty rich. Again, descriptions talk about the grand merchants' houses which are being built there. Many of these still exist in Wakefield today and are really kind of visual evidence of just how prosperous the trades were becoming and manufacturers were becoming in Wakefield at the time.
And you can see some of those. So the other industry you mentioned, that's sort of the industry that, in my mind, always dominated Wakefield, which was coal mining.
Absolutely. There were lots of collieries on the outskirts of Wakefield. George Bradshaw, writing in the 19th century, reports numerous and extensive collieries in the town and neighbourhood. It employed 300 inhabitants in 1831, but more pits were dug later, and there were 46 pits in and near Wakefield by 1869. And eventually, the nationalised coal industry became Wakefield's largest employer, and England's first national miners' trade union was founded here in 1842, the Miners' Association of Great Britain and Ireland. The National Coal Mining Museum is fairly close by. It's about a 2-hour walk, so probably too far for most, but you could, I think, fairly easily get a taxi there or public transport. So there's clearly a real celebration of the industry and its importance to the region just by Wakefield. If you're there for a long weekend, you could quite easily make it down there. Today, there's nothing left really of a working mining industry. The last mine closed in 2002, so nothing left, but still a decent celebration of it in the National Coal Mining Museum.
Okay, so that always shaped my image of Wakefield. I always imagined it as being this very, very heavy industrial city, but actually when you visit, you're struck more by a legacy of the market trading centre. It feels more like a market town than a market city than an industrial city. But of course it was both. One other industry that thrives around Wakefield is the rhubarb industry, the so-called rhubarb triangle.
The rhubarb triangle, this is something I thought was covered very well in Wakefield Museum. The rhubarb triangle is the area that sits roughly between Wakefield, Leeds and Bradford, which is famous for simply producing forced rhubarb. At one point, there were 200 producers in this area, which made 90% of the world's winter forced rhubarb. Forced rhubarb was a process for growing rhubarb longer, bigger and sweeter. It actually used heat. The industry used heat from the coal mines, from the coal dug in the coal mines around here. So there's a link to the coal mining industry as well. The rhubarb were put in dark sheds and warmed using this coal. So they grew longer stalks rather than producing leaves. And what that meant was that more of the plant energy was put into making the edible part, bigger and sweeter. It's quite a famous industry for the fact you can actually hear forced rhubarb growing. Because the sheds are so big, there's so much going on, it's growing so quickly, you can hear the buds popping open. And you might remember, Liam, we actually heard the sound of it at the museum.
Yes, that was very peculiar. I can't lie. Weird, but the popping sound of rhubarb.
Do you like rhubarb?
It has its place. A rhubarb crumble is enjoyable.
A rhubarb crumble is fantastic. I fancy some rhubarb now.
And I gather there's a rhubarb statue. I haven't seen it myself.
There's a statue in Holyfield Park in the centre. There's also a festival every February. I've just talked myself into going. Also, just outside Wakefield is the Walton Hall, and this was where the renowned conservationist Charles Waterton was born, grew up. That's right. Charles Waterton might not be a name who's nationally familiar, but he's a really interesting character and certainly seems to be well known in the local area, and for good reason. He was a conservationist who was born and grew up on the outskirts of Wakefield. He didn't spend long here as a child, but returned later and is commemorated today with a pretty extensive exhibition in the museum, so certainly counts for our purposes. What he is famous for, amongst other things, is establishing what's commonly thought to be the world's first nature reserve at Walton Hall, his family seat. This happened in the 1820s when he returned from overseas to Walton Hall and turned the ground into a nature reserve by building a wall and preventing people from shooting animals. That's basically the thing he's most famous for, creating this large walled off area where animals could just thrive. But he's also famous for really being eccentric. He used to do strange things like pretend to be a dog when guests came round and bite their legs, dress like a scarecrow, sit up in trees. He practiced cupping and bleeding when he was ill, and I'm sure that was out of fashion by the time he lived. When he was living in Guyana on his uncle's estates, he ate monkeys, boiled anteaters and roasted wasp grubs. But Perhaps the best summary of his life has been given by David Attenborough, who said he was one of the first people anywhere to recognise not only that the natural world was of great importance and that it needed protection as humanity made more and more demands on it. He fought against pollution. He's one of the first people to have recorded to do so. He had a local soapworks removed through a court case. And final point on his legacy to the animal kingdom, his pet English Mastiff is the ancestor of all modern dogs of this breed. They all stem from his particular pet. So if you own an English Mastiff, you have a direct connection with Charles Waterton and his pet.
And therefore Wakefield. So
exactly.
This guy, he's clearly done a lot of good to balance his general weirdness, pretending to be a dog and so on. Sitting in trees and pretending to be a scarecrow. We'll let him off that. But there was another side to his life, wasn't there? A more serious side. He managed his family's plantation in Guyana.
There's certainly another side to his life which needs to be acknowledged. And actually, to give the Wakefield Museum credit, they do seem to be trying to acknowledge this now with a new research project. He managed his family's sugar plantation that used slave labour in Guyana. And although, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think he ever personally owned slaves or a slave plantation, he did manage their labour. He did profit from it via his family. But as I said, I don't think Wakefield Museum is shying away from that. They do seem to be currently exploring this aspect of his life more. When we went, they were very clear that there was more research going on to this aspect, and more was going to be coming into the exhibition on him later on about this.
Yeah, and I think when we, in a future episode of the Ye Olde Guide, we will be covering the slave trade in more depth. Let's discuss Wakefield Asylum and Mental Health Museum.
Yeah, it's a bit of an antiquated term now, but this was known previously and quite crudely to our ears as the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum. It was an asylum built in 1816, which was part of a pretty big course of 19th century building work following the accession of Wakefield as the county town of West Yorkshire, which we mentioned earlier. It opened in 1818. It was architecturally inspired by Jeremy Bentham's panopticon principle, which is where the idea that all inmates should be able to be observed at all times without the observers being observable. So you had the feeling of constantly being under surveillance in this institution. Its name was changed to Stanley Road Hospital later on after the Second World War with the introduction of the NHS, and it was eventually closed in 1995 as part of the drive to take mental health care and treatment away from institutional settings, and the main buildings have been converted to flats. But two important legacies today. First, hugely detailed records have been kept, including copious photographs of patients, records of their illnesses and ailments. Their records are now protected by UNESCO order, and they are a fascinating and rich resource giving insight into the care of mental illnesses in the past. Then there's now, the second legacy is, I think, a more local one, the Mental Health Museum, which has been built in the present-day Fieldhead Hospital in the same location. Unfortunately, this is only open during working hours for 3 weekdays per week, so we couldn't go when we went. But I've read reviews. It does seem to be an interesting place to visit if you have an interest in the history of mental health.
Brilliant. So on to the scoring.
I think I'll talk with Charles Waterton. I think in my kind of summing up, I think Charles Waterton's life, it's multifaceted, as we all acknowledged, but it's certainly incredibly interesting. It's left a huge tangible legacy in the area with Walton Hall. It's also commemorated very well today in the local museum, which, as we said, is conducting ongoing research into all aspects of his life, not necessarily the positive ones either. On industry, I think the importance of industry in Wakefield is not perhaps so much that it was important to the world, though it was clearly the important manufacturing trading centre, but more that it gave Wakefield its prosperity and its legacies in the other factors we're looking at today. So there was clearly a lot going on, but as is often our nitpick, there's not so much of there are not many firsts. There's not much that was groundbreaking or world-changing that occurred there. But even leaving that aside, I think it's nice to have a couple of unusual points here and not just bang on about the cloth trades we usually do. You've got the Mental Health Museum, the commemoration of the former Wakefield Asylum. I think those are interesting points. And I'm inclined to give extra points here for the fact you've got something that's a little bit unusual, and it's well commemorated here, which isn't something we often get with the cities we go to. So I'm going to give it a 5.5.
Yeah, I agree. Wakefield was really interesting. I was expecting more on the traditional Victorian industrial revolution type stuff. And actually, there were more surprising things. I thought the tales of Charles Waterton and Forced Rhubarb were really interesting. As you say, we've got a bit of a legacy there, and we've got a museum that wraps it up quite nicely for us. But there's nothing groundbreakingly innovative beyond those relatively small areas. There's no major discovery, major inventions, major new industry that's grown from this city, although it has been an important city in its region. So on this category, I will be giving it a 5. In our fourth category, urban landscape, we look at the buildings that define Wakefield, and in particular what we can see today. Now, we arrived in Wakefield at the refurbished Westgate station and headed up the hill, up Cliff Parade, and we passed a modern civic centre development that houses the museum we've mentioned. That's worth a visit, that's free, it's worth looking at. But the top of this hill are sited Wakefield's grandest municipal buildings. The Town Hall from 1880, the County Hall from 1898, built in the Gothic style. Then heading southeast through some charming narrow streets, we come to the most prominent building in the city centre, the Cathedral Church of All Saints. But whilst the Cathedral Church is very impressive, I think we're going to start on a much smaller surviving religious building, which can be found further south in the town, towards the Hepworth Gallery. We're going to start with the Chantry Chapel of St Mary the Virgin.
We are indeed, because this is a really interesting, unique building. It's a very rare surviving example of a medieval bridge chapel. It was built in 1358. The upper part was rebuilt in the 1840s, but the original stonework remains at the bottom. It really is in concept as simple as it sounds. It's a chapel that was built on a stone bridge on one of the 4 medieval roads into the city. Now,
Why would you do this? Why would you put a chapel on a bridge? Well, it seems like an unnecessary expense.
Well, these were quite common in the Middle Ages. Their purpose was really to provide blessings for travellers, collect alms for maintaining the bridge, and sometimes it would just provide regular services. There are actually only 3 others that remain today, although they were very common before. The only other ones that survive are in Rotherham, St Ives and Bradford-on-Avon. So it really is a very unique survival. It's actually been famous for centuries. Daniel Defoe described it in the 1720s. He wrote, "The Calder passes through this town under a stately stone bridge of 12 arches, upon which is a famous building, by some called a chapel, by others a castle. The former is the most likely." I don't think there's any doubt from its size today that it was definitely a chapel, but still it was noteworthy. And if we go even further back, William Camden, who we encountered earlier, wrote during the late 16th century that Wakefield was famous for a bridge upon which King Edward IV erected a beautiful chapel in memorial of those that lost their lives in battle, which isn't true as an origin story, but it shows that people were writing about it and thinking about it at the time. In fact, various myths have grown up around it. One is that during the Battle of Wakefield, the Earl of Rutland was captured and killed near here. Another, which is repeated in a gazetteer from the 1880s, and by Daniel Defoe, states that, as we mentioned, Edward IV built it in memory of his father, Duke of York, when he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, which is definitely not true. And we should also mention the bridge itself that's built on is almost as fascinating. That in itself is a rare 14th century stone bridge. So really incredible architectural survival in Wakefield.
Other buildings we really should mention. We've mentioned Sandal Castle, which is worth visiting, and it's been invested in so that it's somewhere it's well worth visiting as a tourist. And we've also got earthworks surviving from Wakefield Castle.
We have. One thing I'll mention on Sandal Castle actually briefly is the new interpretation panels they've got there. They've all been drawn by different local artists, and they all depict different aspects of the castle's history. So it's a nice way to draw the local community into commemoration of the past. But yeah, Wakefield Castle, before Sandal Castle, I think you could probably say replaced it. It was the major centre of local fortifications. The earliest record of it is from shortly after Norman conquest, but there are suggestions it might date back to Viking or even Roman times as a fortified area. It was later abandoned, as we said. Sandal Castle kind of surpassed it as the main castle for Wakefield. But the earthworks and the motte survive today. The castle was completely destroyed at some point in the Middle Ages, possibly in a gale in 1330. But its main point of interest since then is that a beacon was lit on top of the hill to warn that the Spanish Armada had been sighted near Cornwall, I think as part of a messaging system. So it's had some uses since then, and you can still recognisably see the area today.
So I want to move back into the city centre now, because we should touch on the layout of the city centre. So we mentioned that it was a large market trading centre, and this has left a legacy in the streetscape, I think it's fair to say, and in the wealth of some of the buildings in the compact city centre.
Yeah, I mean, when I was researching Wakefield, my overriding sense that I was getting was of a medieval, even Norman streetscape with basically horrible modern developments plonked on the top of it. But actually, that's not really fair, because when we went, we discovered quite a lot of, as well as 19th century Victorian buildings, quite a lot of fashionable neoclassical Georgian design here. There are lots of examples of wealthy merchants' houses around South Parade and St John's Square. There is Georgian townhouses built to the north of the town in the late 18th century. A good example there is St John's Square, where the frontages are all the same in a similar architectural style to what we saw in Bath, but the rears of the building contain far more idiosyncrasies. A visitor in 1835, when he saw the extent of the industry around the waterfront, mentioned how rich he thought people were getting, and at the times, and you can really see this in the architectural legacy that's there today. Another contemporary description is an American visitor from 1777 who mentioned that Westgate Street has the most noble appearance I ever saw out of London. And now, of course, we don't know where else this person's actually been in England or who they might have been trying to flatter, but it's still pretty high praise.
It's got some quite good buildings on Westgate Street. You've got the Theatre Royal and a collection of neoclassical buildings along the Westgate Street. I thought that was quite an impressive street.
I think so. And I think also one thing I'll draw out is the look is a little bit distinctive from what we've seen before. In other cities, there's less stonework in the Georgian buildings. There's lots of dark local brick, which really, I think, reflects the regional idiosyncrasies of architecture at the time.
Okay, are there any other buildings that we should touch upon in the urban landscape?
I think we should talk about Cheapside. Mm-hmm. Cheapside is a fairly narrow street that runs through the town. This has got a really notable character of old brick, early Victorian warehouses. They're all original wool dealer warehouses, constructed from 1802 onwards. They survive in really good condition, and some actually have the original hoists at the top for hoisting the wool sacks up to the top floor. You can see them just hanging off the building today. It also has what I'm assured is a fantastic pie shop, which is open until 1:30am on Saturday nights and probably makes an interesting local alternative to a kebab. But
we didn't go there.
We didn't, no.
We had chips.
We'll go there during the Rhubarb Festival.
Okay, brilliant. So look, my thoughts, coming on to the scoring, urban landscape. I wasn't expecting the compact city centre of Wakefield to be as nice as it was. I thought there was a fantastic collection of municipal buildings around the town hall and the county hall. And I thought the way that those buildings blended in to the merchant townhouses you've mentioned, the Georgian buildings, the very narrow streets, the setting of the cathedral, I thought this was a consistent and well laid out and well presented town centre. Yes, there are some late 20th century blights on this, particularly the east side of the town centre. And it's got a couple of big shopping centres interjecting as well, one of which is supposedly one of the earliest of the modern concept of a shopping centre. So I felt that, in general, the city core of Wakefield was very pleasant. But then we come down to the river, and we've got the setting of the Chantry Chapel. And whilst the Chantry Chapel and the bridge and the nearby Hepworth are themselves very impressive, they're a bit isolated from the core of the city centre, and getting to them sort of involves crossing pretty wide and unpleasant roads. So the setting really, the city hasn't yet found a way to make the most of these quite significant, attractive areas. So I think that would be a weakness in the urban landscape. But there's definitely a core there of quality. So I'm going to give it a 5.
Well, my thoughts are, I'm going to start with the chapel as well. I think I'll start with the historical importance. It's utterly unique, and while some of the historical links might be mythical or exaggerated, it's still a fantastic and really interesting historical building to visit. I think you're definitely right to say, though, it isn't particularly complemented by its surroundings. Down in that part of Wakefield, I think you've got to say, quite frankly, a pretty ugly area next to a busy road. You can't move a chapel, obviously, but clearly some development has taken place at some point which perhaps didn't consider the historical importance of that part of the city. The cathedral itself, we didn't really talk about that. It's central, it's nice enough, but it's surrounded by developments, town centre development of fairly mixed quality. I think it does make a nice centrepiece to the city, but I can't say much more than that about it. On the rest of the city, I think the industrial and the post-industrial architecture we have is really interesting. It certainly, as we mentioned, has some idiosyncrasies, and I think Wakefield deserves credit for how much has survived and how much you can spot around there. It's not going to be its highest score because I think, as you said, it hasn't learnt to preserve and present everything that's in its city centre in the best possible way. So for me, it's going to be a 4.5.
A 4.5. Wow. And we've not mentioned the railway viaducts. Oh, we love our trains on the podcast. On the Oldie Guide, we have to mention trains at least twice an episode. Did you know the railway viaduct that carves through Wakefield? It has 95 arches and apparently 800 million bricks were used in its construction. Isn't that amazing?
It's a lot of bricks.
Our final scoring category, reality versus expectations. I have to say, I didn't know much about Wakefield. It's not normally on the tourist trail, and it's kind of overshadowed by larger cities nearby, such as Leeds. But I thought there were some things in Wakefield that really surprised me and that were really interesting to visit. I was a big fan of the Hepworth Gallery. I thought the history of one of the most important battle sites in English history, the War of the Roses at Sandown Castle, and the Shakespearean legacy that's given. I thought that was really interesting. I thought some of the smaller institutions of Wakefield, the museum, the art house, I think Wakefield was a bit more than I expected. So in the reality versus expectations round, I think I'm going to give it a positive score, 6.
Excellent.
What do you think?
I think Wakefield's regional and local historical importance certainly belies its size. I think its intangible legacy today also belies its size. I think you have one of the most historically and culturally important battles that's happened in English history. You have a decent cultural legacy in not only one of the most important 20th century sculptures, but in a local celebration which really makes a lot of her work in the Hepworth Gallery. The tangible effects of the tangible legacies of Wakefield's history do exist. They maybe aren't presented particularly spectacularly in the centre of Wakefield itself. I think you have to look for it. You have to know where to go to see the old Victorian warehouses. You have to get out of the centre for Sandal Castle, Hepworth Museum, or some of the other museums like the National Coal Mine Museum, which potentially could lead to accusations that it maybe hasn't made the most of itself, which is something we've said of other places like Reading when we did our episode on Reading. But I think there are efforts to do this. There is at least a range of museums, if you know about them. There is a range of architectural and urban diversity, if you know where to find it. And there are efforts at modern celebration of its past, not just in the Hepworth Gallery and the smaller museums that live on the outside, but on the pretty interesting Wakefield Museum in the centre. It's not a huge museum. You won't spend more than an hour or so there, but it still celebrates some of the things you wouldn't normally expect to see celebrated in a city of this size. And it's also really pleasing it has ongoing research into some of the less comfortable legacies of its past. I think my expectations were certainly exceeded when I went there. So I'm also going to give it a positive score. I'm going to give it a 6.
Brilliant. And you're right, pretty consistent scores. It's done kind of okay in all the categories, which I think is interesting. And what would you say, just to round off, as I say, it's not somewhere that you'd immediately go on the tourist trail, but I thought as a day out, well, we were there overnight, I thought it was a pretty interesting place to visit. What did you think?
Well, I think one thing it has over, say, Swindon, if I think about back to Swindon episode or some of the other places that we've covered, is that there is a little more to do over more than one day. You won't go there and exhaust everything in one day. You can still get out and see the Yorkshire Sculpture Museum. You can still get out to the National Coal Mining Museum and see various of the other museums around the city. And although I know it isn't the point of the podcast, I think a trip to the Rugby League ground is highly recommended.
Absolutely.
I absolutely loved going there. One of the highlights of the trip.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
But yeah, if we're recommending this for time away, I'd say you could easily get a weekend out of it and have fun.
So big thumbs up for Wakey from Ye Olde Guide. Oh, that's all we have time for. It goes so quickly. Thank you for listening, for joining us on our trip to Wakefield. More details about the podcast and the opportunity to feedback can be found at yeoldeguide.com. And so I think for now, where's our next episode, Daniel?
We're off to somewhere that many of you will definitely have heard of. Many of you will have been there. It's one of the more famous touristy cities we've covered so far. We're off to Lincoln.
Lots to look forward to then. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.